zoom in a little bit and just look at the federal court system. And here you see the structure of it. The lowest level federal courts are they're not even courts really, but the independent regulatory agencies. These are the bureaucratic organizations that regulate everything from pollution to well, anything that gets regulated. I'm having a hard time thinking of other things right now. But manufacturing standards, copyright, anything that the government regulates. And they, of course, if they get into it with somebody they're supposed to be regulating, that can end up going up into the court. There are 91 district courts. These are the entry-level courts for the federal courts. These are spread all over the United States, and this is where most federal case starts. There are some specialized courts. We're going to look at those in a little bit more detail later. They deal with everything from military courts to customs courts to tax courts. There are 12 courts of appeals. There's also the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which we'll get into in a little bit. Oh, wait, there's the Military Court of... the Military Court of Appeals is on that next level there. And then, of course, at the very top is the Supreme Court. Let's talk about the 91 federal courts. They are courts of original jurisdiction. That means that they are the first court to hear the case in almost every event. And they determine the facts of the case. Even if you appeal, you always hear about appeals in movies and TV. Even if you appeal, when you appeal, you can't introduce new facts into the case. You can simply argue that there was a problem with the trial below, or that the law or the precedent being considered needs to be reconsidered. They deal with the following types of cases. Federal crimes. If you commit a crime and cross state lines, that's federal. Don't do that. If you commit a crime, stay in one state. If you counterfeit money, that's a federal crime. These sorts of things will go into, if you defraud the federal government, that's a federal crime. These will go into district courts. They deal with civil suits under federal law and civil suits across state lines. Sometimes, for example, states sue each other. That would go to a federal district court. They supervise bankruptcy and naturalization. That means people becoming citizens. They review some of the federal agencies. They handle admiralty and maritime law cases. If your case happens out on the in water, off the coast, it's not really part of a state, so that becomes a federal case. So don't commit crimes out there either. That's a bad idea. And it also deals with the naturalization of aliens who are trying to become American citizens. The Court of Appeals has appellate jurisdiction. That means most of the cases they hear started out at a lower court, usually a district court, and then were appealed up to the courts of appeals. Typically, they're looking at legal issues. So maybe somebody is arguing that a law needs to be examined and possibly declared unconstitutional, or a previous ruling, we call that a precedent, needs to be re-examined and changed. That's typically how you appeal up to the courts of appeals. They don't have trials. There are not juries and people on the witness stand and all the stuff you see on TV in courts of appeals. They don't hear testimony. They just have briefs from the lawyers, and then they question the lawyers about those briefs. The Supreme Court works the same way. There are 12 of these courts of appeals. And then, of course, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which deals in specialized cases that particularly deal with federal law. They also focus on errors of procedure in law. So if you think there was a mistake made in your trial, you were denied one of your rights, for example, that would be grounds for an appeal up to the courts of appeal. Here they are. Here are the 12 circuits. You can see here we're in Texas, so we're down there in Circuit 5. You will notice that D.C. has its own circuit, number 12 there. That is because the federal government is there, and so it generates more cases than the other circuits. And so it needs its own special appeals court because of all the cases that come out of D.C., because that's where the capital is. The highest level of the court is the Supreme Court. Their job is to ensure uniformity and interpretation of national laws, resolve conflicts among the states, and maintain national supremacy in law. Once the Supreme Court rules something, it becomes precedent for every other court. Well, technically, once any federal court rules something, it becomes precedent for every other court. But the Supreme Court, of course, can't be overturned except through constitutional amendment or by a future Supreme Court decision. So once the Supreme Court interprets a law to mean one particular thing and says it should be applied in one particular way, we looked at a lot of those back in Chapter 4, then all other courts have to follow that. and that's really the power of the Supreme Court. So if the Supreme Court says that the 14th Amendment says separate but equal, like it does in Plessy v. Ferguson, then the law of the land is separate but equal. If it later says separate but equal is inherently unequal, like it did in Brown v. Board of Education, then all the courts have to follow that ruling. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. One is called the Chief Justice. The other 8 are associate justices. The Supreme Court will decide which cases it hears. It controls its own agenda. It has some original jurisdiction, but very few cases start in the Supreme Court. Almost all cases are appealed up through the appellate courts to the Supreme Court. Most cases, of course, start in federal court, go to the Court of Appeals, and then go to the Supreme Court. And most of the cases the Supreme Court hears are civil cases. So here we see the U.S. Supreme Court, and we can see the flow chart here, how cases get to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is also the courts, the state courts' court of last resort. So that's interesting. If I don't like what the Supreme Court of my state says, I can then appeal that up to the Supreme Court. The Bush v. Gore case that decided the 2000 presidential election, where the Supreme Court ruled to stop the recount, which I'm going to talk a whole lot about later, that came from the Florida Supreme Court. It did not go through federal court. It went straight from the Florida Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court also deals in cases involving civil cases between the United States and an individual state, or when 2 states sue each other, or between citizens of different states. Those also end up in federal court, and those have original jurisdiction in the Supreme Court. Also between a state and a foreign country. So here you see, for this 2007 term of the Supreme Court, there were no original jurisdiction cases. So you see, those are actually fairly rare. 47 of the Supreme Court's cases came through the Court of Appeals up that route. 17 were federal criminal cases and habeas corpus cases. These was largely due to the war on terror and the Bush administration's assertion they could arrest people without charging them with crimes. 4 cases came from state courts, started out as civil actions in state courts, and 3 cases started out as criminal actions in state courts, for a total of 71 cases the Supreme Court hears.